You sit there and lie to my face. You're a fraud, Mr. Miles. A disgrace to the uniform. The gavel cracked down like thunder, but it wasn't the sound that turned heads in the small courtroom. It was the venom in the judge's voice, sharp, public, designed to wound. Richard Miles stood alone beneath the seal of justice, his shoulders curved with age, not shame. His skin was sun-darkened, his shirt, neatly pressed but faded, carried 3 quiet military ribbons above the pocket, barely catching the courtroom light. He clutched a manila envelope with trembling fingers, yellowed at the edges. The paper softened from decades of handling. Inside was everything he had left to prove who he once was, and what had been taken. The judge leaned forward over his bench, eyes blazing. You ought to be jailed for this. You think these pity props and worn-out stories make you special? You think the United States government forgot you on accident? Gasps rippled through the chamber. A young mother in the back row pulled her child close, covering one ear as if to protect him from the words or the weight behind them. A few whispered chuckles came from the far row. Cruel, empty laughter. The kind that always found a target who couldn't strike back. Richard didn't respond, didn't argue. He blinked once. The room blurred, and in that single blink, he was back in a different heat, jungle heat, and the smell wasn't old varnish and perfume anymore. It was cordite and wet rust. Then the moment passed, and he stood straight, not in defiance, but with a stillness only men like him understood. The gavel hovered again, a judge ready to end this show. Richard lowered his head, not in defeat, in endurance. And in the very back of the room, seated just behind a column where few could see him, a man in civilian clothes leaned forward. He had said nothing all morning, but now he slowly placed his coffee cup down on the wooden bench. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes fixed on the old veteran's hands. Hands he recognized. They hadn't planned on speaking today, but this courtroom had one witness who wasn't just another citizen. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The courtroom air hung thick after the judge's outburst, like smoke after a close lightning strike. Not visible, but undeniable in the way people sat straighter, avoided eye contact, or shifted their weight as if the floor itself had grown uneasy. In the middle of it all stood Richard Miles, age 82, one step from the defendant's podium, one hand still gripping the manila envelope like it held breath itself. The moment had ended. The moment had not ended. He turned slowly, his knees stiff, the joints groaning with memory, not complaint. A dull voice called out from the clerk's bench, more procedural than personal. Case number 1473, Richard Miles, petition for veteran status re-verification and disability benefits reinstatement. The voice had said it many times before, the same name, the same plea. This was not the first attempt. It would not be the last. There was no emotion in the words, as though the speaker had been trained to file human pain like receipts. The murmur of restless movement began again, chairs shifting, pens tapping. The court stenographer looked up briefly, then resumed her steady rhythm. Her fingers never hesitated, recording a system that had long since stopped listening. No one clapped, no one objected, no one offered a hand. Just quiet bureaucracy and the dull march of forms. Richard made his way back toward the gallery, walking with a slight limp, the kind that didn't draw sympathy, just suspicion. His shoes were polished, but old. His belt buckle was brass, lightly scratched, bearing the seal of the United States Army. He wore it low and snug, not for show, but because the habit of uniform never left a man once it had been carved into his bones. He reached the second row and lowered himself with a care that suggested both pain and pride. The bench creaked beneath him. He exhaled through his nose. Around him, the chamber continued as if he were invisible. Whispers, keyboard clicks, coughs. But his hands told a different story. The right one cradled the envelope, now held across his lap. The left, bent slightly at the knuckles, smoothed it down like a flag. The courtroom's wooden panels reflected the mid-morning light in amber tones, but nothing in Richard's posture was warm. It was rigid, tired, deliberate. His face, lined deeply, with sun-weathered skin and the weary eyes of someone who had long since stopped expecting justice, gave away nothing except patience. Patience, like a man still waiting on a call that never came. On the clerk's desk, a folder lay open to a single page. Typed in black ink were words that repeated every year. Insufficient documentation to verify honorable discharge. No active unit match. Service details unconfirmed. Recommend denial. Beneath the printed lines was a signature. Rushed, stamped, anonymous. "Back again, huh?" came a soft murmur from the stenographer. Not unkind, just tired. She didn't look up. Her tone wasn't mocking, only distant, like someone watching the tide roll in, knowing it would roll out again before it brought anything new. Richard didn't answer. He had heard it all before. He had heard worse. The envelope on his lap contained the same contents it had for years. A black and white photograph from 1959, showing 4 young men crouched in jungle underbrush, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. Richard was third from the left, lean, sharp-eyed, the cigarette in his mouth tilted slightly downward, a grin barely breaking through the camouflage. Beside the photo was a typed letter, an outdated yellowing discharge summary stamped, "Copy, not original." And finally, an aging certificate of valor awarded by a captain no longer alive. To the court, it was nothing. To Richard, it was the entire past trying to prove itself in the present. The judge's voice, moments ago volcanic, was now gone, vanished behind chambers as another case began. But the damage echoed, not in shouts, but in the silence that followed. Nobody offered to speak on Richard's behalf. No lawyer appeared. He had not been assigned counsel. He had not requested one. On the far wall of the courtroom hung a flag, red, white, and blue, still as stone in the room's still air. Richard's eyes lingered on it for a moment. His gaze was not nostalgic. It was something older than that. Reverence wrapped in weariness. Not for what the flag was, but what people had let it become. A bailiff passed near him and didn't stop. Another man coughed behind him and muttered something about wasting taxpayer time. Richard didn't move. He simply adjusted the envelope once again and folded his hands neatly over it, like a man attending a funeral. A bead of sweat formed at the back of his neck. The courtroom was warm, but he didn't wipe it away. His discipline ran deeper than comfort. A quiet voice, younger, uncertain, drifted from behind. "Hey, isn't that the guy from last year? Thought he was like, already approved or something." Another voice answered flatly. "He never had proof. Just shows up every year with a story." Richard closed his eyes for half a second. The memory that came was brief and bitter. A hand gripping his shoulder, a blast in the dark, and the sound of someone calling his name, not with contempt, but desperation. Then silence again. The photo in the envelope was soft at the edges. The men in the image had names, all gone now, all except him. They had been documented once, in a ledger that burned in a government fire decades ago. A fire that erased his brothers, and with them his right to be believed. Still, he came. Still, he tried. One row behind him, a man in a collared shirt with no tie leaned forward slightly. His eyes weren't bored. They weren't amused. He studied Richard the way a soldier studies a terrain, not to judge it, but to understand where the quiet dangers lay. This man, silent, still, took out a pen and began to write. The courtroom clock ticked somewhere above the judge's bench, its rhythm lost beneath the shuffle of papers and the dry monotone of the next clerk reading the next case. It was a rhythm Richard had come to know, not just the clock, but the cadence of indifference. He listened not for words, but for the absence of them. For years, his name had been read into official record and out again in the space of 3 minutes. His appeals reviewed, then dismissed, without pause, without ceremony. He opened the envelope with careful fingers, as if afraid it might tear. The edges of the paper resisted, not from stubbornness, but from age. These were not documents freshly printed from a computer. They were survivors. Folded and unfolded hundreds of times, each crease was a line in a story no one seemed willing to read. He withdrew the photograph first. The corners were soft and white. The image, though faded, was still sharp enough to see the eyes. He held it up toward the judge. The angle was poor, the distance greater than it should have been. His hand wavered slightly, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of holding history alone. The judge did not lean forward. He did not squint. He did not ask for the photo to be brought closer. Instead, he glanced at the image as if it were a receipt from a forgotten purchase, then turned back to his docket. "This doesn't prove anything," the judge said flatly, flipping through pages without looking up. "Could have printed that yourself. Anyone can fake a picture these days." The words didn't hit like a slap. They settled like dust, quiet, dismissive, final. Richard remained still. The photograph lowered slowly to his chest, then back to the envelope. He did not return it immediately. For a moment, his fingers lingered at the edges. He looked at the faces again, not for verification, but for strength. The second document he offered was a copy of his discharge papers, typed in uneven font, yellowed from years in a plastic sheath. The signature at the bottom was partially smudged, the stamp above it barely legible. "United States Army," it read, and beneath that, "Honorable." That word, so plain on paper, was the only thing Richard had ever truly tried to defend. The judge barely glanced. "This isn't original," he muttered. "This isn't certified. We've told you before, Mr. Miles. Copies aren't enough." A small cough from the audience behind him. Someone shifted and muttered beneath their breath, "He's wasting everyone's time." The voice was male, mid-30s maybe, indifferent. The kind of voice that had never been called to prove itself under fire. Richard's throat worked silently, swallowing air more than words. He reached into the envelope again and pulled the last item, a commendation, printed decades ago on parchment. The paper was stiff, the ink slightly blurred from moisture long past. "For bravery under fire, Republic of Vietnam, 1960. The medal it referred to had long been lost, misplaced during a hospital transfer in 1981, but the paper had remained. The judge tapped his pen. "Look, this court isn't a museum. It's a court of law. You want to be taken seriously. Come with documentation. Come with proof. Come with something that actually matters." The courtroom had fallen quiet now, not out of respect, but boredom. They'd seen enough. The air shifted, a little warmer, a little closer. Richard stood motionless, eyes focused not on the judge, but on the desk where his papers now lay. Alone, unopened, unwanted. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in restraint, an instinct honed over decades. He straightened his back, just slightly, the way a soldier repositions under fire. Then he nodded, a slow and private motion, more to himself than to anyone watching. From the back row came a quiet snort of laughter. "This isn't a retirement home, old man," someone whispered. Another replied, "I've seen better cosplay at a parade." The judge didn't react. The bailiff didn't turn. It was noise, ambient, ignorable. But to Richard, each word landed like a boot print on something sacred. He reached forward and gathered his documents again, gently, as if gathering names from a wall. The photograph was last. He slid it behind the others, then pressed the envelope flat against his chest. It made no sound, but something inside him trembled. The judge cleared his throat and leaned back. "I suggest you get a lawyer next time, or maybe stop coming at all. The system's not going to rewrite itself because you're persistent." Richard blinked twice. The room tilted slightly. Not from dizziness, from memory. From the sudden weight of a hot sun above red jungle mud. From the flash of mortar fire and the smell of charred canvas. He remembered a voice shouting through smoke, someone calling his name. Not like the judge had, like it mattered. The courtroom was cold again. Still again. He nodded once more, then turned away from the podium. Behind him, someone was watching, not casually, not cruelly. A man, seated near the exit, had not moved during the entire exchange. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they were following every step. And in his lap, a black pen tapped against a notepad. No doodles, no court sketches, just one name, written neatly across the top: Richard Miles. The gavel came down again, but this time not as thunder, more as punctuation, the kind that ended arguments no one else had the courage to finish. The judge didn't look up as he spoke, his attention buried in the next file, already flipping ahead. "This is stolen valor, Mr. Miles," he said without urgency, the phrase sliding from his lips like he'd used it before. Maybe he had, maybe too many times. But the damage wasn't lessened by the ease of delivery. In fact, it made it worse. The word echoed: fraud, stolen, delusional. And although it wasn't shouted this time, the courtroom heard every syllable. They always heard those words. They were trained to. The kind of accusations that needed no proof, just the absence of applause to make them stick. Richard didn't flinch. That, more than anything, seemed to irritate the room. He stood in place beside the wooden bench, the envelope pressed flat against his side, his back just slightly arched from the long years of a life lived carrying weight no one else could see. His silence was not stubborn. It was something older, a refusal to explain the unexplainable to those who had already decided what to believe. A quiet rustle passed through the back row. A woman in a business suit leaned to whisper behind her hand to the man beside her. Her voice wasn't cruel, only curious. Did they say he served in Vietnam? Wasn't that like classified stuff back then? Her companion gave a half shrug. If he did, they'd have records. Everyone's got records now. A teenage boy, likely waiting for his mother's case, leaned forward in his seat and smirked. You'd think he'd show up in full gear next time. Maybe bring a flag with him. A small chuckle followed. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Richard heard it anyway. The bailiff stepped forward, arms crossed, face unreadable beneath his buzz cut. "Sir," he said, voice clipped, "do you have any official documentation to support your claim? Something from the Veterans Affairs Office? Department of Defense Registry? Anything digital?" His tone shifted on that last word, digital, like it was a key that Richard had never learned how to turn. Richard's reply was nearly a whisper. "That is official. Those are my papers." The judge didn't even wait. "Then you're delusional." His hand waved toward the bench clerk. "Motion denied. Remove him from the docket. We are not wasting the court's time any longer." The clerk scribbled something without looking. The bailiff took a step closer, not aggressive, but definitive, a wall moving forward. Gasps didn't fill the courtroom this time. Just nods, shrugs. The collective shrug of a room full of people trained not to care unless told otherwise. Richard turned slowly. He did not protest. He did not plead. He gathered the envelope once more, lifting it as if it were fragile glass. Inside, the photograph rattled slightly, a whisper of ghosts shifting against the paper. His hands, though trembling, never lost their hold. As he walked toward the row of pew-like benches, someone stuck out a foot, not far, just enough to make a point. Richard paused, adjusted, and stepped around it without comment. But even that small detour felt like a stone thrown at a window. He reached the gallery aisle and made his way back toward the exit doors, one hand on the pew, one holding the envelope. The floor beneath him creaked, not from weakness, but age. Like him, the teenage boy snickered again. What's the next case? Someone claiming to be George Washington? Another man laughed, low and cruel. I'd help him, but I don't do cosplay Marines. No one corrected him. No one spoke up. The courtroom had made its ruling, not just in verdict, but in posture, in the silence that follows when dignity is dismissed like smoke. Richard paused at the door. He didn't look back. He stood there, one breath longer than he needed to, as if committing the room to memory, not out of pride, but to remember what disbelief sounded like. Behind him, the photograph had shifted within the envelope. The corner stuck out slightly, the face of one of the young men half visible now, a grin frozen in another time, eyes too bright to have known what was coming, and a man seated in the far right corner, unassuming, clean-shaven, a folded coat across his lap, sat still, completely still, his eyes locked on the face in that photo, his fingers tightened around a notepad, and the page beneath his pen stopped mid-word. He had seen that face before, not in a photo, in real time, in war. The courtroom doors sighed as they swung outward, letting in a blade of hallway light before closing again behind him. The air inside shifted back to its usual stillness, but something had changed. Not in the way people looked, but in the way they refused to look. Shame, when unacknowledged, had a weight of its own. It hovered just above the polished wooden benches, just beneath the painted seal of justice. Richard Miles stood beside the far wall, near the coat rack no one used. He did not sit. He did not lean. He took a single breath and began to fold his papers again, one by one, with the precision of habit, the kind of folding not meant to tidy, but to honor. The commendation first, smoothed carefully along the crease. Then the copy of his discharge. Finally, the photograph. He pressed it flat, using the side of his palm like a straight edge, not to erase the wrinkle, to preserve it. A scrap of laughter drifted from the gallery, muted now, like it no longer knew if it had permission. But Richard didn't turn. His focus remained on the envelope in his hands, now sealed once more. He ran one thumb along the corner, checking for tears. The edges were clean. Even now in this place he maintained order. He looked down at the bench beside him. A small fleck of dust clung to the polished surface. Without thinking, he brushed it away with the back of 2 fingers. The motion was light, almost ritual. A muscle memory born of mornings long past, when inspections meant something, and every detail was a reflection of character. In the center of the room, the judge was already halfway through the next case, voice droning through legal terms and procedural recitations. The names changed, the stakes changed, but the tone, indifferent, sharp, final, remained the same. The courtroom had moved on. The law always moved on. Richard made no attempt to interrupt. He did not demand a second chance. He did not challenge the ruling. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto the edge of the bench, the same place he had occupied for the last 6 hearings. The wood beneath him creaked faintly, not from weight, but from recognition. He sat straight, not stiffly, not stubbornly, but with the ease of a man who had once been trained to hold formation in blistering heat and pouring rain. His spine remained tall, even as his shoulders sagged under the passage of time. He rested the envelope flat across his knees, his hands folded gently on top. From across the room, a young woman in a navy blazer glanced over, then looked away. Something in his posture unsettled her, not in fear, but in discomfort. It was the kind of stillness that didn't beg for attention, only refused to shrink. The bailiff passed by again, this time without a glance. He didn't need to say anything. The message had already been delivered. The door was open. The ruling was made. Richard was free to leave, but he did not leave. The room filled again with murmurs, rustling papers, tapping shoes. But Richard's quiet anchored the space like an unmoving flag in an indecisive wind. He sat through it all, motionless but not idle, his presence making the silence around him louder. The photo inside the envelope pressed lightly against his thigh. He could feel the shape of it, the slight curve of the paper, the softness of its corners, the faint raised imprint of the uniformed figures. His friends, his brothers, all gone now. But here, in this envelope, they waited with him. He did not look around. He didn't need to. He had seen enough faces turn away to know what came next. He was not waiting for help. He was holding position, because that's what you did when the world told you to stand down. You held anyway. The judge paused mid-sentence, as if forgetting the next phrase, then resumed. a hesitation barely noticeable to anyone except the man in the back row who had been watching from the start. That man still hadn't moved. He leaned forward slightly, his coat draped over one knee, his eyes sharp with memory. His gaze didn't shift from Richard, not for the judge, not for the next defendant, not for anything else that stirred around them. He watched with a kind of tension not born of outrage, but of recognition. Not recognition of a face, recognition of what it meant to endure. Richard adjusted the crease in his pant leg, a slow and careful gesture. Not vanity, not nervousness, just an instinct to maintain order in a world that had become far too disordered. Someone coughed. Another person rose to leave. The room breathed in and out with the rhythm of routine. But at the edge of it all sat a man who had not moved. Who would not move, not yet. The courtroom rolled forward like a slow, indifferent tide. One case into the next. One life pressed through the machine of process. Pages turned. Voices droned. People nodded without hearing. The weight of the morning's cruelty had faded for most, as if injustice could evaporate like coffee steam beneath the stale fluorescent lights. But not for him. The man in the back row had not shifted in over 20 minutes. Not when the laughter broke out. Not when the judge spat the word fraud. Not even when Richard Miles turned and gathered what was left of his history into a fragile envelope. He sat as if bolted to the bench, hands still, shoulders squared, eyes unblinking. He looked like any other mid-level government worker, pressed button-down shirt, clean shave, worn leather boots beneath a pair of conservative slacks. But there were signs, quiet ones, for those who knew where to look. His hair, though graying at the temples, was trimmed with military exactness. His posture betrayed no fatigue, only discipline. His eyes didn't drift. They locked, and when they locked, they saw everything. Across the room, Richard remained seated, the envelope flat on his knees like a folded flag. His head tilted slightly downward, as if in silent prayer, or perhaps in memory. His fingers no longer moved. Even stillness had its purpose. The man observing him adjusted the pen in his right hand, twirling it once between his fingers, then stopped. He didn't write anything else. He just stared at the name he had written a moment earlier, Richard Miles, in clean, bold capital letters. He didn't need to underline it. The courtroom clerk rustled through files, her motions mechanical, detached. She flipped through documents bearing names that would be forgotten within hours. No one had asked why Richard Miles had no lawyer. No one questioned why an old man would return year after year with documents weathered by time and silence. But the man in the back row knew why. He had seen it before, not in courtrooms, but in field tents and outposts, in jungles and deserts, where documentation didn't matter as much as instinct, where records burned and the only proof of valor was whether the man beside you bled before or after pulling you to cover. He leaned slightly toward the woman seated beside him, a clerk, judging by her lanyard, and spoke softly, his voice smooth but clipped. "That man, Miles, does he come often?" She looked surprised to be addressed. Her glance slid toward Richard, then back. "Him? Yeah. Every year, I think. Same folder. Same story. No DD 214 on file. No match in the Veterans Affairs system. His unit was one of the ones lost in that fire back in '73. The man gave no visible reaction, but his jaw moved once, a slow, grinding clench of thought. He looked back at Richard and nodded slightly, not at the man, but at the recognition forming in his mind. A puzzle piece he didn't know was missing had just clicked into place. The courtroom around him faded. He no longer heard the judge's voice or the clerk's papers. He saw only the envelope, the photo inside it, and the man holding it with such quiet care. He stood slowly, without fanfare. The bench gave a soft creak, but no one turned. His presence had been that of a ghost until now, unnoticed, uninviting. But as he stepped into the aisle, the shape of him sharpened. He moved not with urgency, but with clarity. The stride of a man who had made a decision long before he realized it. Each step deliberate, heels grounded, shoulders firm, like someone returning to a position he had once left under fire. He approached the front clerk's desk, nodding once to draw her attention. She looked up, startled slightly by the sudden proximity. "I need access to historical verification logs," he said, his voice low but firm. "Cross-reference registry, Mekong Delta, 1959 to 1962. She blinked. "That's restricted. Are you with—" He produced a worn leather credential wallet from inside his coat. She read it. Her face changed. She didn't speak again, only nodded and turned toward her terminal. He looked back once more at Richard Miles, still seated in quiet dignity at the edge of the courtroom, as if unaware that anything had shifted, as if unaware that, finally, after all the years of silence, someone was preparing to speak on his behalf. The man tapped the side of his ID wallet, then reached for his phone. He didn't rush the number. He didn't need to look it up. The hallway just outside the courtroom was narrow, paneled in bland oak veneer, and washed in the soft yellow light of decades-old bulbs. The kind of corridor where nothing important ever seemed to happen. Just muffled voices, shuffling feet, and the hum of forgotten paperwork. But now, the man who had risen from the back bench walked it with a purpose that shifted the very air around him. Colonel Dean Mercer, retired, United States Army Intelligence, moved with the same posture he'd carried through decades of briefings, operations, and decisions that never saw daylight. His civilian clothes were neat, but nothing about him read civilian. The clerk who had just assisted him watched him pass like a man watching a fuse being lit. Quiet, certain, irreversible. He turned the corner into a lesser-used alcove near the emergency exit, a space designed for no real use, except perhaps quiet phone calls or moments of retreat. He paused, checked his signal, and pulled a battered phone from his coat pocket. It wasn't flashy. It was functional. Scratched along the edge. A smudge near the earpiece. Used, like everything that mattered. He scrolled with one thumb, not frantically, but with intention. The number he needed was not in favorites. It didn't need to be. He had dialed it enough over the years that his muscle memory knew the sequence before the screen finished loading. He brought the phone to his ear and waited. 2 rings, a click, then a voice. "Office of Personnel Archives, Department of Defense. Clearance line 2. He spoke low and firm, no need for introductions. The voice on the other end recognized him before the name left his lips. "Yeah, it's Mercer. Colonel Dean Mercer. I need priority clearance verification for a Vietnam-era field operative. Name, Richard Miles. Repeat, Richard Miles. Unit ran operations in the Mekong sector, late 1959 to mid-62. A pause followed, longer than expected. Then the voice returned, cautious. "Colonel, most of those files were lost. National Personnel Records Fire, 1973. You know that." Mercer's voice didn't rise. It narrowed. "I'm aware. I also know not all of it burned. Some was boxed under classified sections. I was in Phnom Penh in 61. I know what we buried, and I know which names never made it back into daylight." The line crackled. Another pause. "Do you have reason to believe this individual qualifies for restored documentation protocol?" Mercer's eyes narrowed as he stared out a nearby window, where late morning sun bled onto the gray concrete of the courthouse lot. "Not only qualifies," he said, "but if I'm right, and I am, he's one of the few men still living from the bridge at Phuoc Vinh. April 7th, 1960. I've seen his face before. He doesn't remember me yet, but I remember him." The silence that followed wasn't resistance. It was gravity. On the other end of the line, someone had just realized they were no longer handling a routine request. This wasn't a misfiled claim. It was a ghost rising. "Colonel, if that's true," Mercer's jaw tensed. "If it's true, then we didn't just deny him benefits. We erased him. I need everything. Shadow logs, black box manifests, names of non-recorded unit members. I want a list cross-checked against burn recovery files. I'll sign the clearance myself if I have to, but find it." A soft sigh came through the line, the kind that meant wheels had begun to turn. Yes, sir. Give me 20. I'll call your secure line. Mercer nodded once, though no one could see him. I'll be waiting. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his coat. Outside, the courthouse lot remained still. Just a few parked cars, a tree shedding its early autumn leaves, and a young man in a suit leaning against the hood of a government sedan, scrolling his phone, unaware that inside these walls, something ancient was being unearthed. Back inside the courtroom, Richard Miles hadn't moved. Colonel Mercer turned from the window and began walking back, slower this time, not from fatigue, but from the weight of what had just been set in motion. The hallway just outside the courtroom was empty now, save for the sound of Colonel Mercer's shoes tapping softly against the linoleum, a rhythm steady enough to be deliberate, but soft enough to carry no threat. His walk wasn't rushed, but there was an urgency curled inside it, tightly wound, as if the years between now and that muddy riverbank in 1960 had suddenly shrunk into arm's reach. As he stepped back into the courtroom, his presence barely registered. The judge was deep in a custody hearing. A woman's voice broke in sobs. Papers were passed from one desk to another. Nothing about the room suggested history was about to be rewritten. But Mercer's eyes were locked on the man seated in the far pew. Still, quiet, envelope resting across his lap like an heirloom. Richard Miles hadn't moved since Mercer had left. His hands remained crossed over the worn manila paper. His legs were squared, his spine straight. His face gave nothing away, but the weight behind his stillness spoke volumes. He had the look of a man not waiting for help, but for confirmation that the world was exactly as unjust as he had always known it to be. Mercer made his way down the side aisle, careful not to draw attention. He didn't nod at anyone, didn't ask permission. His steps brought him to the row behind Richard. He paused there for a breath, his hand brushing against the back of the bench. The old wood was smooth, polished by decades of courtroom traffic, but Mercer barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the curve of Richard's shoulders, the slope of the neck, the back of a head he hadn't seen since the firefight that nearly ended both of them. He took a seat without a word. The space between them held the silence of two men trained to wait for the right moment to speak, not for civility, but for accuracy. Words, after all, were weighty things between soldiers. They had to be earned. For a long minute, neither man moved. The court continued its business. The fans above turned slowly, slicing through thick air and old mistakes. Then Mercer spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, just clearly. "Do you remember April 7th? He said, his voice barely above a breath. 1960? Richard blinked once, but did not turn his head. Mercer continued. Bamboo Bridge, 2 clicks west of Phuoc Vinh. 4 bodies in the river, 3 charges buried in the bank, 1 boy in a red scarf. Richard's fingers shifted slightly on the envelope, just enough to press the paper tighter against his leg. There was a flare, Mercer added, and a scream. Richard closed his eyes, slowly, deliberately, not to shut Mercer out, but because something had cracked loose inside him, something long buried that didn't need explanation to surface. Mercer leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. "You dragged a man out of that river who didn't belong there, a civilian, not even supposed to be in the province. His leg was gone. You tied it off with your bootlace." Still, Richard didn't speak. But the silence between them was no longer empty. "You wore a stitched patch on your shoulder," Mercer continued, voice soft. "One of your own, hand-stitched, white thread over black." Richard finally turned, slowly. Just his head at first, then his eyes. They met Mercer's, and in that gaze, quiet, unwavering, tired but unbroken, was everything that had been denied in court, year after year. "You were there," Richard said. 4 words, but they hit like a shell drop. Mercer nodded once, not out of agreement, but out of confirmation. "I was," he said. "I didn't know your name then, but I never forgot your face." Across the room, the judge continued to speak, oblivious to the seismic shift occurring in the back row. "I tried to tell them," Richard murmured, the words dry as old parchment. "Every year. Nobody listened." "They will now," Mercer said. "I've already made the call." Richard looked away again, not to dismiss him, but to collect himself. His throat worked against a sudden weight. A breath caught, then settled. His fingers tapped once on the envelope, then stilled. "They buried that bridge," Richard said after a pause. "Covered it like it never happened." Mercer's gaze didn't waver. "We're digging it back up." The courtroom carried on with the sterile monotony of bureaucracy. The shuffle of folders, the gavel's steady rhythm, the low drone of names and numbers filtering through thick air. Another case had begun. A property dispute. A voice raised. Another lowered. The judge tapped his pen against the edge of his chair, half listening, half agitated. But none of it registered with Colonel Mercer, who now stood again from the back pew, this time not quietly. He walked forward with the precision of someone who had commanded operations where a misstep meant body bags. Not fast, not loud, but absolutely seen. And when he passed the gallery, the slow hush that followed wasn't because anyone recognized his name. It was the way he moved, like something official had just entered the room that didn't come from the court. The bailiff noticed first, a step toward him, cautious, instinctual. Mercer didn't break stride. He reached the bench and spoke, calmly but clearly. "Your Honor, I need 5 minutes. That man," he nodded back toward Richard Miles, "has been denied justice for over 40 years, and I am here to correct that." The judge blinked, thrown off. "You are not counsel," he said, his voice rising, as if volume might restore authority. Mercer's tone didn't change. "No, sir, I'm not. I'm Colonel Dean Mercer, United States Army, retired. And if you don't let me speak, General Kearney will be on the phone with your bench before you break for lunch." The courtroom stilled. The judge's lips parted, but no sound came. He studied Mercer for a beat too long, then leaned back slowly in his chair. "Proceed," he said, and the room, once filled with muttering doubt and quiet derision, now hung silent. Mercer turned slightly, positioning himself in the open space between the court and Richard, not facing the judge, not facing Richard, but turned where both could see him. His voice, when it came, was measured, cold, clinical. In April of 1960, a covert unit was deployed to the Phuoc Vinh district of Vietnam, operating under a provisional code unrelated to any formally recorded division due to diplomatic interference in the region. One of those missions was the Bamboo Bridge Rescue. It involved 4 confirmed combat fatalities, a civilian extraction, and the disabling of 3 enemy-placed explosives. He let the words hang for a second before continuing. "The man responsible for that extraction, and for saving at least 3 United States lives, was Richard Miles. His identity was redacted in the final operation report to protect the identity of a deceased diplomat's son. Classified at the presidential level, never reinstated." Someone in the gallery gasped, then covered it with a cough. Mercer reached into his coat and produced a plain folder. It bore no markings, no government seals, only a strip of red tape across the top. He held it out to the judge, who hesitated before taking it. "I had this declassified 15 minutes ago," Mercer said. "His records were never lost in the fire. They were sealed, buried under foreign relations statutes." The judge opened the file slowly. His eyes moved left, then right, then froze. He swallowed hard. Mercer's tone was steady. "You've denied him every year on the grounds of no documentation. You laughed at the same copy he carried for decades, the one printed from a scan of the original. The original, Your Honor, was locked in a drawer beneath the Pentagon." Richard hadn't stood. He remained on the bench, envelope still in his lap. But now, his head had lifted, his eyes locked not on Mercer, but on the judge, not defiant, not accusing, simply waiting. "I've also initiated a correction request with the Department of Veterans Affairs," Mercer added. "Restoration of full honors. immediate approval of backdated benefits, and retroactive recognition of combat valor. He stepped back, just one pace, enough to make room for the weight of the words to settle. The judge stared down at the open file, no longer flipping pages, just holding them. His gavel sat untouched beside his hand. His chest rose once, deep and slow. Then quietly, he spoke. "Mr. Miles." Richard didn't answer. "I was wrong." The judge's voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It carried farther than the shouting had. And this time, no one laughed. The folder still lay open in front of the judge, its pages untouched since Colonel Mercer's final words. The red tape across the top seemed to bleed into the polished mahogany of the bench, as if the truth itself had finally stained the furniture that had so long denied it. The courtroom was silent, not the silence of boredom or waiting, but the heavy, aware stillness that settles when people begin to realize they've been sitting in the presence of something far greater than they knew. Richard Miles hadn't moved. His hands remained resting on the envelope, fingers light and still. He didn't need to lean forward. He didn't need to demand acknowledgement. The room was doing that for him now, slowly, collectively, as heads turned in his direction, as glances shifted from pity to guilt, from guilt to awe. The judge cleared his throat, not to speak, but to gather himself. It was the kind of sound people make when pride has been cracked open and something unfamiliar, humility, begins to leak through. He didn't look at Mercer. Not yet. His eyes were locked on Richard, as if the man before him was no longer the one he had berated, but someone older, deeper, something unnameable that demanded reverence. The judge began, but the words caught. He pressed his lips together, then tried again. "Why didn't you tell us this, Mr. Miles?" Richard raised his eyes and met the judge's for the first time all morning. There was no bitterness in his expression, no victory, only calm. He spoke softly. "I tried," he said. "Every year." The words weren't accusatory. They were simple, a statement of fact. And that, more than anything, seemed to break something in the room. Mercer stepped forward again, slower this time. Not as a soldier now, but as a witness. The bridge mission was sealed to protect a name that never should have been there. Diplomatic family. A death swept under layers of red tape. The men involved were sworn to silence. 2 of them died in that same op. 1 was buried without a name. 1 survived. And he's sitting right here. At the back of the room, the bailiff who had earlier escorted Richard toward the exit now stood straighter, his hands unfolding from across his chest. He looked not at the judge, but at Richard, and something behind his eyes softened, not in apology, but in recognition. Mercer turned slightly, addressing the courtroom itself. How many others were lost in that fire? How many more men like him are out there, still being told they imagined their sacrifice? No one answered. The judge looked down again, then slowly closed the file. His hand moved over the red tape, and his fingers lingered there as though to say, "This should have been opened long ago." Then quietly, he set the folder aside. "Effective immediately," he said, voice steady. "Mr. Miles is granted full veteran status under emergency archival override. The Department of Veterans Affairs will receive the order by end of day. His benefits, compensation, and recognition will be backdated to the date of original discharge." No applause followed. There was no cheer, just breath, released slowly through parted lips, through tight chests, through the weight of understanding. The kind of breath people take after surfacing from deep water. A woman in the second row, the same one who had whispered earlier, now pressed a tissue gently to the corner of her eye. The teenager who had joked about cosplay Marines no longer looked smug. His gaze was downcast, fixed on the wood grain of the bench, as if it held answers he had not earned the right to read. Mercer stepped back beside Richard, not saying a word, only placing one hand gently on the edge of the bench, not for balance, but solidarity. From the left side of the room, a new presence entered, a man in a dark blue jacket bearing the patch of the Department of Veterans Affairs. He carried a narrow black case tucked beneath one arm, and a sheaf of papers in the other. "I was told to deliver this in person," he said softly, approaching Richard. "It's an expedited reinstatement packet. It comes with our deepest apology." He laid the case on the bench beside Richard, then opened it slowly. Inside was a new discharge certificate, clean and crisp, and beneath it, folded neatly in black felt, a ribbon bar, complete with a small bronze star, polished but simple. Richard stared at it for a long moment. Then, with steady fingers, he reached for it. Not quickly, not ceremonially, just carefully, as if it might vanish again if he moved too fast. He didn't put it on. He just held it, and that was enough. The courthouse lobby looked no different than it had a week prior. Same faded gray tile underfoot, same dull brass trim on the doors, same bulletin board sagging under the weight of flyers no one read. But to those who had been in the courtroom that day, the air felt different now. It moved slower. It carried memory. Outside, the autumn wind stirred golden leaves into slow spirals near the sidewalk curb. A few passers-by glanced toward the front steps, where an elderly man with a modest black folder tucked beneath one arm made his way through the front entrance. He wasn't escorted. He didn't arrive in a uniform or a suit, just a navy blue windbreaker and a simple collared shirt pressed at the seams. Richard Miles walked without hurry. The limp was still there, but it had changed. Not softer, but steadier. He moved with the weight of 82 years in his joints, but something lighter in his chest. Like something that had been carried too long had finally been set down, without making a sound. Inside the lobby, the security guard at the desk looked up and gave a nod. It wasn't forced. It wasn't ceremonial. It was real. "Morning, Mr. Miles." Richard paused, nodded back once, and continued toward the benches along the eastern wall. The same row where he had waited countless mornings for hearings that always ended in disappointment. Today, the courtroom door remained closed. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to sit. From the folder, he pulled the same photograph he had always carried, the one of 4 young men in jungle fatigues, arms draped over each other like brothers. This time it was laminated, preserved. A small tag on the corner now read, "Official Unit Archive, 1960. He placed the photo beside him on the bench, and with his other hand, opened a slim manila envelope containing fresh documentation. A confirmation of his updated records, a letter of recognition from the Department of Veterans Affairs, and, tucked gently beneath, a handwritten note from Colonel Dean Mercer. "You never stopped standing. Neither will I." Richard didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just read the words, folded the paper again, and slid it back into the folder like it was something sacred. At the far end of the hallway, the bailiff from a week prior stepped out of a side office. He saw Richard, paused, and instead of walking away, turned and approached. He stopped just short of the bench, cleared his throat once, then lowered his gaze. "I didn't know," he said simply. Richard looked up, nodded once, and replied, "Now you do." The bailiff didn't speak again. He just reached into his pocket and handed Richard a small item, a silver lapel pin bearing the emblem of the United States Army. It was unboxed, worn, not new, but clean. "I thought you might want this back," he said. "You dropped it last year. I kept it. I wasn't sure why." Richard turned the pin over in his palm. It was his. He remembered. The clasp had broken. He had meant to fix it. Never did. He pressed it into the fabric of his collar without a word. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing past the courthouse glass like a soft reminder. A younger man in a tan coat stepped inside, paused and looked around. He was a veteran too. The look was unmistakable. He saw Richard, gave a subtle nod, then crossed the room to sit beside him. The two didn't speak. They didn't have to. They just sat there, one old, one young, as another morning passed beneath the seal of a government that had finally remembered its own. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Miles didn't feel like a man asking to be seen. He felt like a man already known. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, And if this moment brought back memories you carry with you, the best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.